You're shortlisted this year for the BBC National Short Story Award. Could you tell me a little bit about your story, The Heart of Dennis Noble?
Yes. The Heart of Dennis Noble began as a commission from a wonderful British independent press called Comma Press. And again, they're doing ground-blazing, trailblazing work. They brought together a group of 17 writers, gave us a list of eureka moments in science to choose from for our own story. So we looked down the list of inspired moments in physics, breakthrough moments in biology, chemistry, and so on. And I'm really quite fascinated by the cross-fertilization between artistic inspiration and scientific breakthroughs. So I was supposed to be working on my novel and finishing that, and I promised myself I wouldn't take on another. As much as I love them, I was getting really serious with myself and said, no, you can't take on another story commission until you finish your novel, Alison. And then I was persuaded, and I was happily persuaded, and I took it on, and scanning down the list of all of these breakthrough moments, I saw something about the electrical signalling in the heart. And I think throughout the body of my work, there's things about, very often, images of high energy, images of electricity. I can't really say why, but I was immediately, my head sort of went like that when I saw it, and I felt, kind of hairs go up on the back of my neck, and I thought, that's my story. So from that point on, I went to meet the scientist who in 1960 made this discovery about the fact that in the heart, it's not a component part, it's not only a pump, as we used to think, a sort of bit of machinery. It's in fact a living system, many of its aspects are based on feedback loops, and not just sort of upward causation, but downward causation from. So if we're afraid, the heart is it's a sensitive thing. It's like a sensitive animal, really. And I went to meet Dennis Noble in Oxford to talk about his moment, his breakthrough in 1960, which of course is never a single moment. It's a series of things. And his research from that moment in 1960 has now led to things like the virtual heart, computer modelling through which they can track arrhythmias and so on. So we had a nice afternoon in Oxford. I didn't arrive with the most practical questions even. At one point I thought I would interview him, and then I thought, no, I'll just listen and see what emerges. And the story very overwhelmingly is fictionalised. Because I didn't want to steal his life, I didn't want to intrude upon his life and push it on the page. So we didn't really go there at all into the personal, but he gave me a wonderful sense of his trust in the writing of a story, and so I remained as absolutely true to the science as I could, and then invented a fictionalised Dennis Noble and brought him into the story.
The real man sounds like a remarkable guy.
Yeah, he is. He's phenomenal.
The story, as you've hinted at, has a lot of practical narrative of science, what's going on within the heart.
Yes.
Did writing it require more discipline than other stories you've written?
Yes, it did in a way, because I was so conscious that I wanted to do right by Professor Noble, by Dennis Noble, that I didn't want in any way to smudge the facts of what he'd achieved, and so I felt a great responsibility to that. And then, but of course, as a writer, you also are responsible to the story itself. So I did. I certainly, and a lot of my stories, even where it doesn't show, even in that story, there's also a slaughterhouse that figures. And maybe it's funny, and I'm not sure if it is, but it was as important to me to get the slaughterhouse details right as it was to get the details of the work in the lab right. I felt sort of indebted or responsible to fictional slaughterhouse men, really in the same way as I did to the character of Dennis Noble at that stage. So I find the details of the world. Really, I find them, frequently, always inspiring. Just the stuff of reality is strange. I love its strangeness. I love the sort of surreal qualities of 21st century life. I love the details of history. And so, as a writer, what you're doing with the facts, you're trying to honour them, I think, if you're a good writer, I think. But you're always on the lookout for the gaps between the facts, and that's where you, as a writer, go in between the facts. You don't distort them, but you invent in the gaps, and that's your space. And the story has to dovetail facts and invention so that nothing stands out as one or the other.
Your story has been read recently on Radio 4 by Tim Pickett-Smith.
Yes.
What was it like hearing your work on Radio 4? Have you had your work read on radio before?
I have. 2 years ago, perhaps, on Radio 4, and other bits and pieces. But
yeah, what was it like?
This was of another order. I mean, someone here in Cork during the festival said, "Gosh, you know, Tim Pickett-Smith, what a voice! He sounded like God. It was like having God read your story." And it's true. It was. I felt, you know, hugely moved and grateful, and I could just hear the immense care. I mean, he's obviously the most, wonderfully skilled actor, but, skill is there, of course, but I also just felt this tremendous care he took with every sentence, that as the writer, you absolutely want someone to get the rhythms right. And I listened to it live as it was broadcast on Radio 4, and I was in my front room. It was coming through my computer, and I suddenly realised, gosh, I was pacing around my front room. People going by, I must have looked slightly mad, and I realised I probably looked like a father outside a delivery room, pacing, couldn't quite control what was happening on the inside, just waiting for the moment to make sure everything was delivered and fine. And it was, of course, far more than fine. It was remarkable, really.
That is a brilliant metaphor for hearing your story delivered,
just
like a father outside a waiting room.
Yeah, even though I'm a woman, but that's probably the closest I can get to it.
So your first short story collection, 15 Modern Tales of Attraction, was published by Hamish Hamilton in 2007, and you're working on your new collection now.
Yes, I am.
Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose I'm still in the area of thinking of what it will be, and I've been doing a lot of commissions, which have been, sheer pleasure. For me to be invited to write stories and paid to write stories is every writer's gift, really. Every writer's greatest gift. But of course, I'm keen to bring out another. I love novels. I love short stories for completely different, virtually different, many different reasons, and. This collection, I haven't told anyone this yet, so it's my working title anyway. It's a working title. It's the title, what will probably be one of the stories in there. It's called All the Beloved Ghosts, and in a funny way, this story with Dennis Noble is although it's the one that's had the most sort of attention to date, for obvious reasons. This is an area I've been working in, working with this sort of strange, permeable boundaries between invention and fact, or fiction and reality. I've probably since my first novel, I've been really intrigued by the sort of shadowy, beautifully porous boundaries between fiction and fact, and memory and the imagination, and those sorts of things. So, obviously, the Dennis Noble story will be a kind of keystone within it. But also, there are other lives, other real lives explored, including, for example, a story about my great aunt in Canada, who had a sort of really sad ending, and the story was covered up within the family for years. She basically was returning from a dance after midnight, got a lift home with a married man. The way home was over a harbour covered in ice in the winter, and they took a chance a few days too late after the weather started to turn, and the car went through the ice. And it was a incredibly sad thing, and a scandal immediately the next day. He got out, she drowned, she was in a heavy coat, and this story was a commission piece I did for the Asham Award collection a couple of years ago. It's called The Thaw, so again, and I don't change the names. I'm sort of perhaps a bit brazen, bold. I'm not sure. So the name MacLeod appears in there. Her name, Marjorie Genevieve, is there, and I sort of wanted her to be lifted up and not covered over anymore. So that's yet another story. And there are a few that work that fine line, I hope, between fiction and and history or fact, or whatever the case is.
That faithfulness to reality is a really striking aspect of your work.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Simon.
Definitely. So, if I were a general reader who doesn't read short stories...
Shame on you. Yes.
I know, here,
yes.
surrounded by
yes.
short story evangelists,
yes.
what a thing to say.
Yeah.
But what would you say to me to encourage me to read short stories?
What would I say to you? I would say that, yes, that on the reading, that they sort of require a little bit more investment from the reader than, say, a chapter of a novel. In novels, you sort of sink into them, like they're sort of comfy, slightly baggy sofas. But short stories, they're economic, they're tense, they're taut, and the quality of a great short story is that it sort of lifts you up, that sort of, you're not sinking down, you're sort of soaring up. And that investment of intensity, I suppose, from both the writer and then from the reader, creates a kind of jet fuel. And so the best short stories have that quality of jet fuel that in a novel you don't really seek to have in the same way as a writer. They're two quite different effects, but the short story has its own remarkable effects, and it's almost as if at the end of the story, to kind of use a completely different metaphor, you lift your head up out of a bucket of cold water and you're left breathless by the best of them. When I'm reading short stories a lot, I get addicted. I find them, there's some kind of mainline shot to your blood system. They're remarkable, exquisite and remarkable.
That investment really does pay off quickly.
Yes, I think it does. So yes, they're kind of more intense, more concentrated experiences while you're with them, but they reward the reader hugely. I think for some people who are coming new to them, it's just sort of gradually realising that there's a crude phrase, a wonderful payoff with the best of them at the end. And yes, I know that if a short story is a bit middling, you think, what am I reading this for? What have I done it for? But there are so many great stories out there that are not middling. It's finding the great story writers, and there's an abundance of them working at the moment.
Great. Well, Alison MacLeod, shortlisted for the BBC National Short Story Award. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon.